Everybody, welcome. It's actually wonderful to see this many faces. It's fantastic. And I also see a bunch of faces from Maine that I know, which is really cool. Thank you for coming and supporting. I think a lot of my Maine folks know this story very well, but it's just good to see your faces on screen. And so the first thing that I'm going to do actually is share my screen. I have some slides. And I want to tell you, Sherelle, confirm for me you can see? Yep. I want to start actually with my personal story about how somebody from central New Jersey ends up in Waterville, Maine. Before my 5th year of rabbinical school, I had never been to Maine. I knew nothing about it. And where I grew up in New Jersey, I grew up in a town called Manalapan in western Monmouth County in New Jersey that actually has a very significant Jewish community. And it had an even larger Jewish community when I was growing up. The town had at least 7 synagogues. It probably has more now. And if you went into the local ShopRite, not only would you find a kosher butcher within the local supermarket and a kosher fish stand, we even started in the year 2000 to support Israel Aisle. And when I tell that story to small town Jews, including my own children, they can't believe it. When I tell them that public schools were canceled on the high holidays, that I and my brother did not have to make the choice between going to school and going to synagogue on the high holidays, it's really beyond what they can imagine. And when I tell the kids in my little Beth Israel Hebrew school that they served matzah pizza in the public school cafeteria in the town where I grew up, they cannot believe it. But when you grow up in the New York metropolitan area, especially at the time when I grew up, that was quite normal. And so I had never been to Maine. My understanding of Maine, as with most people, was LL Bean, the lobster industry, and it was where many of my wealthier classmates from Wellesley went to summer, which was not a verb that I was familiar with growing up on the Jersey Shore. And in my 5th year of rabbinical school, I was placed as a student rabbi in Waterville. So there was a program funded by the Legacy Heritage Foundation out of Ohio to place conservative rabbinical students at the Jewish Theological Seminary at small congregations around the country. Traditionally, small communities are served not by conservative rabbis, but usually historically by Reform rabbinical students at their Cincinnati campus, but all 3 of their campuses, and often Chabad, an ultra-Orthodox group. But the conservative movement really doesn't have a strong presence in small town America. And because one of our deans had his most formative experiences in small town communities, he created this program. And my classmates were sent around the country to Reno, Nevada, to the Mississippi Delta. And I was the only one that was placed in northern New England, and I was placed in Waterville, Maine. And that was the first time that I went there. And I served there in my 5th year of rabbinical school, flying up from Park Slope, Brooklyn, up to Waterville, Maine, once a month and 2 major holidays. And the congregation kind of blew my mind. It was like nothing I had ever experienced in my life. I had different congregants that would drive an hour and 20 minutes south to the Portland Jetport to pick me up. And on those rides, I would get an impression of who these individuals were. And of course, it shocked me because in the Jewish community where I grew up, if you had a guest scholar, you sent a taxi or a car service. You didn't send your congregants to go physically pick them up, certainly if it wasn't an hour away. But every time a different congregant would come to pick me up, the other thing that got me right away is, okay, they took this time, at least 3 hours to come and pick me up and bring me to Waterville, number one. And number 2, they always came with a gift. And this was Tiffany, who was our synagogue president at the time. She was behind this, and I didn't know that. But there was always something. It was hand knit gloves. It was blueberry muffins. It was, matzah candy brittle. It was always something. It was always delicious. And by the end of the year, I had a lot of mittens. It doesn't snow anymore in New York, but at the time it did. And it was really wonderful to have all these mittens. And as I was going into placement season, which is a very stressful time for 5th year rabbinical students, I was interviewing in Chicago, New York, LA, Boston, and it was a very fraught time just in general, but also I was the first person who was openly gay when admitted to the seminary and ordained. And so it's never really pleasant being the first. And so I didn't know what placement would look like. And also, not to blow anybody's mind, but being a woman in the conservative rabbinate is still a challenge. So I knew that there would be all of these challenges, but things went pretty well through the placement process. And Tiffany pulled me aside, the synagogue president, on my last visit as a student rabbi. And she said, I want you to stay. And I just laughed in her face. And I was like, there's no way. There's no way I'm going to be the rabbi of Waterville, Maine. And I said, I love you guys. I love that after Shabbat, you take me out to mainly Brews to go hear cover bands. I love that you take me snowshoeing on Sunday afternoons before I have to fly back to New York. I love everything you cook for me. And yet the whole reason you have a student rabbi is that you can't afford a rabbi. And she said, but we want you to stay. And so there was this little nagging voice in the back of my head of maybe Waterville could work. And, you know, a few things came together to make Waterville my home. One was Colby College, the local elite small liberal arts college in Waterville. I'd been working with their Hillel that year and having a good time. The provost was a Camp Ramah alum. And she said, if you stayed, I'd make you the Hebrew professor. And at 27 years old, that was quite exciting. So that sweetened it. And plus, then I knew I'd have health insurance, which was pretty important to me. I know Sherelle from Israel, she's like, what? Yeah, but my number one priority was health insurance. I was like, okay. So that's exciting. I get to be on a college faculty. I love to teach. And the other thing that sort of got me was, why shouldn't Waterville have a rabbi, right? Here I am. I fall in love with this community. If I really believe that every Jew deserves Torah, and I know this community and I love this community and they love me, why am I dismissing this out of hand? If they're willing to dig deep into their endowment to pay my salary, if Colby is willing to pay my benefits, maybe I need to give it a shot. So the last piece was my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, was living in Tel Aviv, actually with Sherelle. And she knew Maine better than me. She spent summers here growing up. And I said, you know, Mel, I want to give Maine a chance, actually. I think that this is really exciting. And she said, I only want to live in one of two places, New York or Tel Aviv. Those are the only places in the world I want to live. But I'll give you 2 years. This will be great for your resume when we go back home to New York or when we make Aliyah. And so this will be a 2-year adventure. And so what you'll see on the left of that slide is actually my first weekend. My hair is a little bit messed up because I went swimming at Tiffany's Lake right before that picture was taken. And you can see I was 27 years old and I developed the nickname Baby Rabbi, which thankfully is a nickname that I no longer hold. But that was my first weekend at Beth Israel, and I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to serve this little community that put its faith in me. And it also, I don't want to let this pass. You know, a lot of the congregations in LA and New York told me that I was a very competitive candidate, but they were not ready to hire somebody that was openly gay. But this little congregation in rural Maine, and Maine is a politically bizarre state, and we'll talk about this later, you know, they were willing to. There was one person in the congregation that made it an issue at the congregational meeting. And it was actually Mert Wallman, may her memory be for a blessing, who at the time was 87 years old. And she said, this woman, she's young, she's willing to come. We in Maine don't discriminate. All that matters is that she's willing to come and serve us. And that was the end of the conversation. Nobody ever brought it up again. And Mert shut down that conversation, and they came down with a contract down to New York that I signed, my first contract. What you'll see in that middle slide is that I was joining a congregation that had fallen on hard times. There were 19 families left in the congregation when I came on as its rabbi, but the congregation was founded in 1902. It had been around for over a century, founded by Jewish peddlers. And what you see is a picture actually from 1957, when the congregation moved from a large old wooden house where there was a women's section in the balcony and men were below, into the building that we currently have, where men and women were seated side by side. And it was a great adventure for all of Waterville, not just the Jewish community. And you can see my community there with American and Israeli flags, along with our Sifrei Torah and the chuppah. And I don't know why the chuppah was there. I think they just decided to get out everything big and carry it over into the new building. But this was a community with a very strong sense of history. It still is. And those 7 founding families of Beth Israel are still tightly connected to our congregation even today. But one of the challenges, of course, is that even though those families were still connected and there were some relatives still left in Waterville, most of them had left. And most of them had left for the reasons that most people had left Waterville. Its population was twice what it is now in the 1960s because the factories had shut down. Waterville didn't used to really be a college town, although Colby and Thomas have always played an important role. It was a factory town. There were all sorts of shoe factories, textile factories on the shores of the Kennebec that shut down during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s through globalization. And when jobs left, people left. And when people left, money left, and opportunity left. And so Waterville has had its ups and downs, but what you saw was a story from 1902 up until the mid-60s was a story of real ascent and growth. And then starting really in the 1970s was a story of, at the very least, population and economic decline. Although the Jewish community remained deeply loyal, deeply committed, kept their shul going. But at its largest, Beth Israel probably had 150 families, and families were significantly bigger back then. Most Jewish families had 3 or 4 kids. By the time I was there were 19 families left, and many Jewish families had many fewer children. So the raw number of people had declined significantly. And so what you'll see in the last image on the right side of the page is when I came in, I'd been working as a student rabbi with the Hillel and the congregation. And what I used to do is I'd go up and we'd cook Shabbat dinner on campus with all of the students. And then I would literally run down to my car, get in my little Subaru, drive down to campus, and then I would do Kiddush and Moti there. And I'd give the same exact sermon. And so there were about 7 students on campus and about 5 people, middle-aged and elderly, down at the congregation. And I was like, this makes absolutely no sense. Why is it that I'm doing the same exact thing twice, less than a mile apart for 2 different communities? And so Mel really said, you know what, Rachel, you just need to find some way to bring everybody together. And that's what we started doing. We would bring either the community onto campus for things like Sukkot and Passover, or we would bring the students down for certain special Shabbatot or Purim. And all of a sudden we had critical mass. And critical mass in Maine is more than 10. Critical mass is a minion. I'm not talking about 150, right? Because 12 feels a lot better than 5. But what ended up happening is we didn't combine just into one community, but we decided in very intentional ways at very intentional times to bring folks together so that we could build enough momentum, enough sense of critical mass that the Jewish community could begin to grow. And that's precisely what happened. Now I'm giving you a fast forward, but if you come to Waterville now, right, 13 years later, what you'll find is that Shabbat on campus happens every single week. When I first came in, it happened twice a year. Then I convinced the students to do it once a month. Now it happens every single week. If it didn't happen every week, the students would probably lose it. And we have an average between 40 and 50 kids that are on Shabbos, here at Shabbos, and they still cook their own meals. I won't let them get a caterer. They still cook their own meals and they still do their own dishes, which is very rare, up at Colby Hillel. And down at the congregation, we still sometimes do have those Shabbatot of 5 to 7, but then we'll also have, the Saturday morning service of 30 to 35. And when I first came in, there was 1 Friday night a month. Now we have 2 Friday nights a month and 2 Saturday morning events. And in January, February, sometimes we still struggle to make minyan, but what you'll find is these services now of 20 to 30. We just had Purim on a Monday night of over 50. So real critical mass, and our congregation vacillates between 65 and 75 member units. So my life took this unexpected turn. Mel says 2 years, then we're leaving. But then things start to grow. Colby really gave us free rein, as did the congregational board. They said, you know what? Do what you want, whatever works. And so what Mel and I and the team that would become the Center for Small Town Jewish Life started doing is, okay, if bringing together the Hillel and the synagogue works, what happens if we start creating other collaborations? And in my third or fourth year as rabbi, I reached out to Rabbi Erica Ash, who is in that center. She's on the far left of that center image, and my wife Mel is in the middle. She was the brand new Reform rabbi. And I was friends with the Orthodox rabbi down in Portland back from when we were in New York. So I said to Akiva and Erica, I said, I think I can get this grant. Why don't we try and bring all of our congregations together for Shavuot? And they said, sure. We can't make minyan at Shavuot at either of our congregations. And so we put out the call to every congregation in the state of Maine to join us. And we had about 70 people coming to Waterville, Maine, for a statewide Shavuot celebration. And it was really transformative. And what you'll see, and this is what's really great, that's the major highway in Waterville. So the minute you come off right across from the KFC, you'll see always every June, welcome to Waterville for the Maine Conference for Jewish Life, which was beyond what anybody could imagine. And of course, it's sponsored by Central Maine Motors Group. And we also are sponsored by Patriot Subaru because they're owned by Jews. And they said, we can't just have the non-Jewish car dealership sponsoring this Jewish conference. So we had this unique statewide gathering funded by local car dealerships and national Jewish foundations, along with a very, very nominal fee for those who wanted to come and engage in 2.5 days of intensive Jewish learning. So things started to grow. We created a fall Shabbaton so that our Hillel students could be involved in statewide Jewish life, bringing awesome Jewish musicians to Central Maine. We created a low-cost summer camp for Jewish kids in Maine that couldn't afford to go to the established Jewish summer camps in Maine. You know, if you say to your average Maine Jew, do you want to pay $8,000 a summer for each of your individual kids to go to summer camp? They'll look at you like you're crazy, right? That is just not what is possible for the people who we serve. Waterville, Maine, in our public school system, over 80% of children are on free or reduced lunch, which means that the overwhelming majority of children in our community are reliant upon government benefits. So when you're talking to a community where a significant portion of the population is middle or working class or struggling with poverty, the way in which most things are priced in the mainstream Jewish community is just beyond what they can even imagine, beyond, you know, not to say what they can afford. So our summer camp costs $5 a day per kid. So it's not free, but it's just enough so that basically everybody can afford it, although some people still go subsidized. And the way that we run it for free is that the rabbis do it out of the goodness of their heart for their communities. And we get our Colby Hillel students who go through the torture of learning modern Hebrew with me. They get to use all of their Hebrew to teach kids throughout the state of Maine. By the way, it's Jewish and non-Jewish kids. And so you have this sort of cadre of little Maine kids, Jewish and Jewish adjacent, that know all of the animals and all of the foods and all of the colors in Hebrew. And so that work started to gain recognition as we received more funding from larger Jewish foundations, as we began writing about our work. And it became all the more important in 2016, which I thought was only going to be a significant year in my life because I had a baby, but it became significant for other reasons too. It was the end of the Obama administration and Donald Trump had just been elected. And the Democratic Party was like, maybe we have a problem with rural and small town America. And so I received an unexpected phone call from the Obama White House asking me to deliver the final benediction at the final Hanukkah party of the Obama administration. Now, usually the rabbis who are invited are from large congregations in New York or LA. They are very large and public, politically oriented rabbis. I am not a particularly politically oriented rabbi, and I am in Waterville, Maine. And so I asked, I said, I'm not one of those rabbis. Why are you inviting me? And they said, we understood that it's dangerous for democracy to ignore small towns. So we made a point. We want you to be the final voice talking about small town Jewish life at the White House. And that allowed us to grow even further. And as Colby allowed the center to continue to grow, as the synagogue continued to grow, Mel and I decided we got married in that synagogue. We had our babies in that synagogue. We brought our communities to Israel. We combined with the congregation in Auburn. So our two communities came together. It was the only trip to Israel my congregation in over 100 years had ever taken. I don't know. I think the Auburn congregation had been before, but we had a small town focus. So we went to small towns in the Negev in southern Israel so that we could have a small town encounter between small town Israelis in what is called the peripheria. But Maine Jews understand what it is to be in the periphery too. And that created some beautiful connections. And on the far right, what you'll see is our two communities at the Maine Friendship House in Jaffa, which still stands. It was a little piece of home in the Tel Aviv suburbs that's left from a Christian community that came to Jaffa. Long story, but it was a really cool thing to see a Maine house built by Mainers from Jonesport, Maine, in the cultural capital of Israel. So that's my story, but my story fits into a much larger picture. There are over 1 million Jews, 1 in 8, live in what we would consider to be small towns or communities that have fewer than 10,000 Jews, right? So not New York, not LA, not Miami, not Seattle or Chicago, right? A pretty significant number in aggregate. And one of the things that really defines our work is an attention to class, because class is really, it impacts everything that we do. As I mentioned, nearly all of the children in my community, in Rabbi Ash's community in Auburn, very high percentages of our children qualify for free and reduced lunch, which really, that's true of the kids in our congregations as well. Sometimes people think, oh, that's not a Jewish problem. If it is, it's Holocaust survivors or Soviet refugees or ultra-Orthodox Jews, but that's not a problem elsewhere in the Jewish community. That is not true. That's not true in rural America. It's also not true in suburban and urban America either. And so part of what we do at the center is try and just open up a space to talk about that socioeconomic diversity. There are many fewer adults that have a bachelor's degree in our congregation. And if they do, it's often from schools that don't have large Jewish communities, which, by the way, if you're talking the past 25, 30 years, means it's kind of hard for those kids to go on birthright if they want to, right? Things that we associate with the American Jewish college experience. We're also culturally removed from trends that reflect wealth. So I always sort of bring this up. Class is not just about a number in your bank account, because actually there are some very wealthy Jews in our communities as well. But because they are not part of a collective experience of wealth, they don't have the cultural awareness of what wealth looks like and how to act in more affluent communities, which often creates a sense of alienation when small town Jews go to mainstream summer camps or even Hillels if they're going to larger universities or institutions. The example that I always bring up in relation to this is some of the kids in our community can afford to go to Jewish summer camps in the conservative or reform movements, but they're wearing the wrong clothes and they don't even know what the right clothes are. And that can often create a long-term sense of alienation from the broader Jewish community. Because if everybody you're surrounded with gets their clothes at Walmart, you probably will too. And so then you go to a URJ camp, Camp Ramah, and everybody's wearing the fancy brands, and you are instantly marked and alienated from that larger culture. And the last thing is Jewish philanthropy is focused heavily on poverty relief. My discretionary account, Rabbi Ash's discretionary account, first of all, has a lot less money in it than rabbis at large congregations, but almost all of the money from our discretionary account goes towards rent, heating, legal bills, and car repair. If you ask most rabbis from large urban or suburban congregations, what do you use for your discretionary account? I help a student go to Israel. Maybe I'll help them a little bit if they want to do something extra special for a service project with their Hillel when they're in college, right? That's not where our money is going. Our money is making sure that our congregants don't fall further into poverty, which is also to say that that fund is not being used for us to travel and get professional development, which often is not on the minds of large Jewish institutions when they ask, if they are asking, why aren't there more women or people from outer lying areas coming to our conferences? That's part of the reason why. Also, there's a lot of diversity in small town Jewish communities. People often think rural America is purely white, but that is not true. Not even in Maine, which is the whitest state in America. My community is actually deeply multiracial. And it does a lot of harm when people assume both internally and externally that there are not Jews of color in our communities. There are, and those numbers are increasing as urban and suburban areas become unaffordable. The overwhelming majority of my congregation is interfaith or intermarried, so multicultural Jewish families. I am a conservative rabbi, but 80 to 90% of my congregation is interfaith. And this is very important. We are unable to self-sort politically or culturally. If you live in a place, you know, in the types of Jewish communities I grew up in New Jersey, in New York, you can choose a synagogue, if you're going to a synagogue, where the rabbi and the majority of the congregants vote like you, think like you, and practice Judaism like you, right? You cannot do that in a small town. You cannot shop around. The reason that most people are members of my synagogue is not because they agree with me politically and certainly not religiously. They are members of my congregation for two reasons. One, because they live close by, and two, because their friends go there. That's it. That's really it. We have a few people who really want a conservative congregation, but they are a minority and they're often driving from very far away. So what that means is that when I give a sermon or when we put together a program, what I have to bear in mind is I have everyone from the most MAGA Trump supporter to the most left-wing Bernie person. And I need to speak and take care of all of them, both extremes, everything in between. And everybody needs to understand that you need to live in this community with people who disagree with you, who vote differently than you, and that practice Judaism differently than you. And I think that that is a blessing. And you'll see our synagogue fundraiser is often the best meal in Waterville every year. Over 100 people, fully kosher meat that comes through the mail through Grow and Behold. But our chefs, one is from Venezuela and one is from Puerto Rico. They're both members of the Shul. They're amazing chefs. And Kosher Caracas was one of our first ones because Nilda, who is part of a multi-generational Jewish family in Waterville, she wanted to bring the tastes of home to Waterville, and we had a delicious kosher Venezuelan meal. The other blessing that comes out of scarcity is that everything is DIY. You know, in the synagogue where I grew up in, we had a caterer. You want cookies, you go to the kosher bakery. You want a kiddush lunch, you go to the bagel shop or to the local kosher caterer. You can't do that. There is no kosher caterer in Maine. There's my wife. That's it. And she can't do it alone. So the congregation, if you want a chicken dinner after Friday night services at your kid's bar about mitzvah, you better be prepared to make it yourself. And that's true of everything. People have a lot of agency. There's a lot of accountability and a lot of cooperation because it's necessary. And this is the reason why, if you look at the individuals who lead major Jewish foundations and institutions in the United States, if you're looking carefully, you'll see a lot of them grew up in small towns like Waterville. Why? Because when you're raised in a Jewish community where if you want something to happen, you have to do it yourself, you are going to be primed for a life of leadership. The downside of that is there's increased potential for burnout due to limited human resources. You know, there were some people when I came in who had served on the synagogue board for over 60 years nonstop. That's illegal in most large institutions. You need a certain amount of turnover, but you can't have that in a small community because you don't have enough people. So that's the downside. And there's always a lot of pressure to try and increase the size of the community so that you can give people a break, but it's not always possible. So there's the culture of leadership. What you have here is there are a few kids that grew up in my congregation. Chloe Geller is one of them. There's her in Israel with me. Every kid that has gone through Hebrew school from age 5 to college with Mel and me is now on Hillel board. We make sure of it, but they feel very comfortable serving on their Hillel boards because they've been leading in their own way, setting up and cleaning up after every service from the time they're 5, 6, 7 years old. They're flexible, creative, innovative, determined, and accountable. So we at the Center for Small Town Jewish Life, this organization that we founded that is part and parcel of Colby College, we've created certain strategies to help small town Jewish life succeed. One, to attend to issues of class, which means being very aware of what things cost always, and always having conversations with our leadership team, which is now 8 people. What is the price point where we can pay our bills, but we're excluding no one? Those conversations happen way too rarely in the American Jewish community, but we have no choice but to attend to those issues. We foster Jewishness rooted in a strong sense of place. Maine Jews are different than Vermont Jews. Also, Bangor Jews are different than Portland Jews, are different than Auburn Jews, are different than Waterville Jews. And so we always try and bring together what's special about Maine and count it as an asset instead of a liability, so that the congregations don't get dispirited from what they lack, but actually celebrate what they have. One of the coolest things about Waterville is that we have a historical Lebanese community that came right about the same time as the Jewish community, and also a Franco-American community that came out of Quebec around the same time. And that unique cultural mosaic to have a Lebanese church that has its mass in Aramaic, not less than a mile away from a synagogue, to be able to have our Lebanese neighbors and hear the mourners Kaddish and say, oh my God, that sounds like mass. Or when we go for First Communion for our Lebanese friends and understand all of the biblical verses that come from the book of Isaiah, that's like really cool stuff. We seek institutional synergies. We've become very good at not playing power politics and not getting territorial so that we can cooperate. And we invest in professional leadership. Almost all of the money for the Center for Small Town Jewish Life goes towards salaries. We invest in people that are passionate about service and equity, and it has benefited us all. And so I am going to stop my share there. That's a little bit about who I am, the work I do, some of the strategies we've created for survival, and when we're lucky, some sense of thriving in Maine. And I look forward to a discussion with all of you about small town Jewish life and life in Maine.
Thank you, Rabbi Isaacs. It's really interesting. First of all, I'll say I'm going to open the chat now for everyone so that just you can share, because I want to say that other than questions while you were speaking, there were some beautiful sharings about other people's experiences of small town Jewish life, and it's really nice to see it kind of coming from different places. I do want to start with some more like down-to-earth questions that came up, because even, for instance, you mentioned how you use your discretionary account for like car repairs and legal bills. So what's that about? How, as a rabbi, do you make a decision that that is part of like your larger role?
Sure. I mean, it comes down to ein kemach, ein Torah, right? Without bread, there is no Torah. If my congregants do not feel safe, if they are not fed, if they are not cared for, then nothing else really matters. You need to be healthy and situated and safe to a certain extent to be in community and to have the dignity necessary to accept and contribute spiritually, emotionally, in every way. And so my number one job, I think Rabbi Ash feels this way, Mel feels this way, everybody on our team feels this way. Our number one job as Jewish communal professionals is making sure that the Jews in our community are cared for and dignified in the lives that they lead. And so what that means is, if I have the power to prevent a congregant losing their home or losing their car that they need to get to work, if I can make sure that they can pay their medical bills because they're uninsured, right? Those needs need to be attended to first before I teach them Hebrew or expect them to make minyan right? And I think for me, it was always obvious that that's what a discretionary account should be for. And I just have to thank God that I've never had to say no, that somehow, even when the balance has gotten really low through some act of God or faith or whatever it is, there's always been enough. But the rabbis were right. If you do not feel physically safe, then expecting spiritual fulfillment or education is just not going to happen. And so I actually think it's one of the most sacred and important things that I do.
Thank you. Another more, I'd say smaller question before we jump into some of the big stuff. You mentioned that a large part of your congregation is interfaith. So a question, first of all, is that true of other small towns, or if you know the statistics? Also, were there any conversions, or are there any conversions? And if and how does it impact the services and rituals?
So that's a lot. I'll try and get to a few of these.
Small question.
Small question. So yes, it is much more Maine is the most interfaith state in America, at least according to our latest data. It is a feature of small town and rural Jewish life. In large part, I realized this very quickly. I'd get there and people would tell me their stories. And sometimes I'd often hear, well, of course I married somebody who wasn't Jewish. I went on to J-date and everybody who came up was my cousin, right? I mean, that's very real. That's just a very real part of being a small town Jew. And so what you find is actually often third and fourth generations of interfaith families. And often one of the critiques of interfaith families is, well, it can only last a generation, but that's not true in small towns at all. It's really a matter of dating pools and experience, and also, just part of being America in 2023. So it's happening in all of the non-Orthodox movements, but it happened much earlier in small town Jews in terms of, chronologically. And it's much more common. In terms of conversion, interestingly enough, I have performed 0 conversions for the sake of marriage. None. I have performed many, many conversions and continue to perform many conversions. It's actually one of the major sources of growth in rural America, but not for the sake of marriage. It's really people who are spiritually seeking. Small town and rural Americans tend to be more religious. And if, for whatever reason, Christianity is not working for them anymore, often their first step or their first stop is the local synagogue. And so we have many people who are religiously oriented, but Christianity isn't there for them anymore for whatever reason, and they come into our communities and many of them convert. And that's actually a wonderful source of strength for our communities, of course, because often the people who convert are more passionate about Judaism, and they also come from a background of religious observance, even if it came from a different religion. And so it's not unusual in small town communities or large communities that those who are Jews by choice often end up being the most committed members. And what I will say is very exciting is that we just were engaged in a major campaign for Beth Israel in my synagogue, and part of that was raising funds for a mikvah. And so we will be building a mikvah in the basement of our synagogue because there are so many conversions. And we want to make sure that there is a mikvah in the state of Maine that is open to non-Orthodox Jews. So there are many fewer mikvahot than there were 100 years ago, clearly, but most mikvahot that are being built today are not open to Jews who are not Orthodox. So it was important for me when we were going through a synagogue renovation that we took advantage of that renovation to create a pathway for those who want to join the Jewish community and also just want a new avenue towards spirituality, that a mikvah be part of that experience. So conversion is the life cycle event I perform the most, right? It is the life cycle I perform the most. And I'm very thankful that it now outnumbers my funerals, which I did not think was possible because there are not many births in Maine in general for anybody, Jews and non-Jews. We are an old state, not many babies. So conversion is how we make new Jews. And I love it. I love it.
Okay. Another question, maybe slightly less smiley, but if you can talk a little, I'm sorry, about aunties. I still have a smile from the babies.
Yes, sorry.
If you can say a little bit about anti-Semitism, is that something historically prevalent in Maine? Is it something of contemporary life there?
So anti-Semitism has always been in Maine. It's not new. What I think is there were lulls in anti-Semitism in some suburban and urban areas that now have a resurgence. In Maine, it's just always been there. So if you talk to older members of my congregation, they'll talk to you. The two big department stores in downtown Waterville were always owned by Jewish families. And oftentimes they would come to their stores early in the morning and there would be swastikas, spray painted on their stores. And they would tell me stories of, we'd have to get there at 6 o'clock in the morning to paint over it so nobody would know that it was there. Or the experiences of being yelled at or spit at, walking to synagogue on Shabbat or the high holidays. So there's always that element that has always existed. For what it's worth, that has never happened to me in Waterville. You can't see it on Zoom really, but I wear a kippah. I wear a kippah every day, everywhere I go, and I have never been targeted, nor have my children who have modern Hebrew names. But I've heard from many of the families in my congregation of the stories of what's happened to them in schools. What's more likely to happen in small towns is the stories that I hear of Jewish kids on sports teams that if they don't go to practice or they don't play a game on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, they can't play for the rest of the season, right? Just no sensitivity to missing classes, real punishment for missing exams. And by the way, I mean, that also happens at Colby, which is quite cosmopolitan and progressive, right? It's just part of having small numbers, right? And I'll say it comes from both sides. There's the historical sort of traditional anti-Semitism of you don't belong, you're not Christian. And then there's also the anti-Semitism or the anti-Jewish discrimination, I put it, that comes even from the more progressive spaces in town of, what smart people aren't religious. Smart people don't have ethnic identities, right? That I get from my faculty colleagues, as do my students. So, that's tricky. So it happens. But one thing I will say about the anti-Semitism, I want to say two more things about the anti-Semitism. One is it really bothers me when I go back to New York. I've been here now for 13 years. And I go to New York, I go to LA, I go to Chicago. I'm telling my story. And people say, how do you deal with the anti-Semitism? And I'm like, why do you assume that things are worse in Waterville than they are in New York? Because if you look at the statistics, most of the most violent crimes against Jews are happening in Brooklyn. They're not happening in Waterville. They're not happening in Auburn. But there's this feeling, people are rural. People are poor. They're ignorant. They must hate Jews more. And I think that is unfair. And I think it is untrue. I don't think Waterville is more or less anti-Semitic than any place else right now. I think there's a lack of awareness, but that is mostly the result of the fact that we're a tiny community. So I think that's more of where it comes out of. And the other thing that I'd say is related to that is that when I've brought my congregants of all ages to Israel, I think that they have a very different relationship or an experience in Israel than often when I bring my Hillel students that come from large and wealthier Jewish communities. Because when you're the only Jewish kid in your class or in your school, when you are harassed verbally, right, at school for being a Jew, where nothing is built to reinforce or affirm your Jewish identity, when you are, like my kids, the only Shomer Shabbos kids for miles, to be in a city like Jerusalem, where everything shuts down for Shabbat, and you are one of millions, right? Where you can feel normal, right? The other element that I would say is when you get to be part of a major Jewish community, where most of the people you encounter are middle and working class, that's very affirming. And I first experienced that. I didn't grow up poor, but I didn't grow up rich. I grew up middle class. But I grew up middle class enough that when I went to Jewish summer camp or Hillel, I felt out of place and like I didn't belong, like there was a certain amount of shame. that my family couldn't afford some of the things that other kids at my camp in Hillel could. And one of the things that was so affirming for me, and I see this in the kids that grew up at Beth Israel, when I lived in Beersheba, which is at the time, it's much wealthier now, but a very working class community in Israel, it felt so good not to just be in a place that was Jewish, where the majority of other Jews that I encountered were middle and working class. So there's a different response, I think, in many ways. There's an appreciation. If you don't grow up with a lot of isolation and in your face anti-Semitism, I don't think Israel necessarily will always feel as important. But to the kids from my community, when they went there, I could see they just sort of relaxed and felt a certain sense of resonance that was different.
Thank you. I'm going to jump into another question. And I will say I love the conversations in the chat. I feel like I'll try and see if I can copy them for you for later to watch, because it's interesting to see these interactions. But we'll go on with more questions that came up. You mentioned the sermons and having to like serve a community with very extreme opinions. And I was wondering about like this, I'd say values versus community. I think in many cases, and I can say this I think true for Israel too, we do choose our communities so that we don't have to clash with this question. So I'm wondering, how do you create that balance between, I'm assuming you have strong, your own values, sense of truth, what you think, and how do you balance that with serving and being part of a diverse community?
The way that I have dealt with it, when I deal with it at my best, which is not always, I'm human, but I think when I do the best job, is when either through sermons or through learning experiences, what I do is I mine the Jewish tradition for debates, where everybody of their opinion on a certain issue can see themselves reflected back in the Jewish tradition. So I'll give an example. When same-sex marriage came on the ballot in the state of Maine, that was obviously a very personal experience for me, right? I mean, I wanted to marry my wife, and I had very strong opinions about it. But I was also coming out of the conservative movement where the majority or a good portion of the faculty was opposed to gay and lesbian ordination and gay and lesbian marriage. So I had gone through institutions where people didn't agree with me, even about something that dear to me. And not every gay and lesbian student had this experience at the seminary, but a lot of the rabbis that I had that I loved the most as teachers were the most conservative. And I knew how they felt theologically on this issue, but the respect that they granted me as their student. And that shaped me in a certain way. So when it was time for me to provide the sermon when that was coming up in Maine, what I did is I crafted the sermon in a very particular way where I outlined through the sources both sides of the argument. And I made very clear that regardless of what side you took on this issue, there was a place for you within the Jewish community and within the Jewish tradition. And that I wanted to pull out both of those threads. And then I said, we're not all going to agree, but here's my opinion based on both sides of this debate. And I hope that you'll agree with me, but I know that not all of you will. And it's important for me that you understand that I affirm the Jewishness and the belonging of every single member of this community, whether you agree with me or not. But what I want you to do is do the exercise that I did, which is really examine the tradition for both sides of this argument, and also to take a moment to really see my face and the experience of my family when you make this decision. And that sermon that could have really torn the community apart actually made the community stronger. And it was incredible, the number of people who came up to me who said, you don't know how much it meant to me, Rabbi, that you gave me the space to be my authentic self with you, even though we disagree on this issue. Now, some of them ended up changing their mind, right? And voting for same-sex marriage when they weren't planning on it. And some of them didn't. But it was a test of my rabbinate, I feel, to make my opinion known, to lay out those opinions, and then to say, even when we disagree, there's a place for everybody. So I try and curate discussions that are multivocal. I try to affirm the place of difference. And I think that the Jewish tradition, it's not boundless. There are bounds of the Jewish tradition and Jewish life. But within those bounds, there's always been debate and disagreement. And that has been the path to arriving at truth. So I want that spirit, that agonistic spirit, to come through so that through the debate and through crafting healthy conversation, we can disagree while remaining in community. As you know, that is not a popular approach to leadership in Israel or the United States right now, right? There are very few people. What I am advocating for in many ways is a form of classical liberalism that is very out of fashion. And so the challenge is for me to hold my ground in that set of beliefs at a moment when my approach is seen as betrayal by people on the extreme left and the extreme right. Holding that center ground is not easy, but I actually think it's an authentic representation of the rabbinic tradition, and I think it's the only way we can survive as in small towns.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of want I wish those words could resonate further and wider. We have a few more minutes, and I do want to ask you about a special project that I know is in the works and the makes and is crazy, as only small town Jewish life can be. So I think it's I don't know if it's named already, Etrogim, or if that's just a working title that I happen to hear, but can you share a little bit about this latest crazy venture?
Sure. So, there are plenty of times I think I should stop myself, but I don't. And that is true also of my colleague, David. But I got this email one day from a non-Jewish farmer in Saco, Maine, and she said, some of my Jewish friends approached me and asked me if you could start growing etrogim for Sukkot. And so I want to contact you because I'm not Jewish, but I need supervision. And I need somebody who's halachically, Jewishly, legally knowledgeable so that I can start growing these etrogim. And so I reached out to David and I said, you live in Portland. Can you be the mashgiach? Can you help this woman grow her etrogim? And he got very excited. So he spent many, many Shabbatot studying Hilchot Etrogim, all the laws of etrogs, which neither of us spent a lot of time on in rabbinical school, because for most of us in the American Jewish community, if you want an etrog, it comes from either Israel or North Africa. It is shipped to our synagogues via Brooklyn, and everything is just sort of shipped from around the world from Israel. And but you can't use those etrogim often for liqueur or cooking because, the mitzvah around an etrog is the way that it looks, not its flavor or its, whether or not it's edible. And I said to David, wouldn't it be amazing if we grew our own etrogim and we had them available to the Jews of Maine? And then if they were certified organic, because this is a certified Mafka organic farm, then we can do a statewide project of making either etrog liqueur or a cake or something, whatever. And so it takes several years for an etrog tree to grow before you can actually use the etrogim. And it's actually quite complex, but the etrog trees have been planted. They will, God willing, come to fruition within the next 3 to 4 years. And we at the Center for Small Town Jewish Life will distribute them. We can get the willow, the Hadas and the Arava. It's willow and myrtle. It's the palm that we can't really grow in Maine. But, we started making and selling through the center our own Hanukkah candles that were hand dipped by a family company out on the Maine coast, because during the pandemic, we couldn't get Hanukkah candles in Maine. They didn't make their way up because of supply chain issues. So Maine has a culture beyond its Jews of agriculture, organic agriculture, family-run agriculture, and just doing things yourself and handicrafts. So part of the work of the center is creating further community by engaging our neighbors in DIY agricultural and crafts projects to serve the Jewish communities of Maine locally, sustainably, and in line with our eco principles.
amazing. Yeah. I'm just checking in with the other questions I received just to see, because I think we have a moment. Maybe if you can say something about the relationship with the non-Jewish communities, because there are some special ones. If you can just give us
So I think that part of being in a small town and being a small minority is that you develop relationships with other communities, and it pays off. I mean, I think it's good in general, but also after Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, I think every synagogue in America felt incredibly vulnerable. I think every Jew in the United States felt really scared, right? And when we held a vigil at Beth Israel in the wake of the Tree of Life shooting, our synagogue was packed solid, right? It can hold about 200 people seated. It was standing room only. We had about 300 people packed into our synagogue, and it's Maine. So everybody came with like deviled eggs and baked goods and everything else. Everybody came with food. And, you know, for the Jewish community, that's so small to look out. But part of the reason everybody came to support us is, how many times have I been at Mass at the Lebanese church to support the Abuna? Many times. How many times have I gone to the Catholic Church to teach about Jewish traditions, Passover? You know, we just had a joint Tu B'Shvat Seder with a group of nuns, the Sisters of Leon, a Franco-American, you know, group in Maine. Well, when you're constantly engaged with the greater world, when you're lucky and things are going well enough in a small town, they show up for you too. And that's part of the reason I love this work.
Thank you very, very much. I do want to say that the chat had a lot of conversation about where people feel welcome. And I think it's a beautiful conversation to have. So I know I haven't garnered many questions from that thread, but I think this question of where do we feel welcome as a Jew, as a practicing Jew, and in what spaces and how to open that up is definitely in the spirit of what you were saying. So thank you for that. Thank you, everyone. You'll be receiving a recording of the session with follow-up links, so you can also check out what's going on in the small town of Waterville in Maine and kind of look at everything they're doing there. Thank you, Rabbi Isaacs, for joining us. Thank you, everyone. If you're not a member or have no idea about CSP and you want to check out what we're doing, we're mainly online right now, so yeah, come and join us. You can check out our programs here, and I will say that I think 95% of what we're doing is free of charge, and if you're able to become a member, that's always great, because you're supporting this wealth of knowledge that is accessible to all. So thank you, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you in more of our programs, and have a good day, good afternoon, or good evening and night wherever you are. Thank you.